When I was but a wee little baby, I remember watching Duel Masters. I don't remember much of Duel Masters itself, mind you, but I do remember one scene that's been etched for my memory for this past 20 years. In episode 1, Shobu, the main character, is playing against Knight, the resident edgy boy. And after some back and forth, Shobu seems like he's winning, he's on the offensive in the matchup. Until he plays into a board wipe into a mass removal spell, Holy All.
My turn. Holy All. Finish it. Dodome.
Which Knight activates for a surprise win. Now, it's a memorable scene for me because by now I must have done it 100 if not 1,000 times. And every single time as I felt that pang of pain in my chest, that scene has flashed in front of my very eyes as my opponent informed me to remove my cards from the battlefield. Interestingly enough, as I've been researching for this video, I found out that the card that Knight uses in the episode, Holy Awe, is actually not a mass removal spell, it's a mass tap spell. So I guess I've been living a lie for this past 20 years. But it's too late to stop now. I have considered the design of removal cards and I'm going to talk about them today. I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed and this is the removal video. Now, very briefly on what I consider removal cards. Removal cards remove cards from the active zone of play, from the battlefield as it's most often called in many games. It does not remove cards from the hand, that would be discard. It does not remove cards from the deck, that would be mill. That's an important differentiation, I feel, because removal applies to cards that your opponent has paid for in some form, either in the form of card advantage or the resource that your game uses. So, any discussions of removal are going to be discussions of efficiency and cost-benefit calculation. Removal is of course further differentiated into damage-based removal, where you have to deal a set number of points of damage to a creature to remove it, and spot removal as it's called, where you just remove the card from the field if it has certain characteristics that are described on your removal card based on a prerequisite. So those are removal cards, and removal cards are an example of what's called direct interaction. Negative interaction to be specific. And based on my general experience with the wider tabletop sphere, many people just don't like negative interaction. Some of them may not even like direct interaction. They would prefer to play games in parallel with their opponent rather than against them. But come on, most of the larger CCGs are games of direct negative interaction. You are working to beat up your opponent, to move their life counter to 0, so we will have to go a bit deeper than just saying, hey, people don't like removal because it's negative interaction. And as we go deeper into the analysis of the role of removal as well as which elements of it are considered unfun, I think its nature gets a bit more interesting. So, removal differs in its ubiquity and power level between various games. Now, this is obviously a fields-based metric, so you're welcome to disagree with me based on the differences in our experience with the games and the particular meta that we might have played them in, but in my opinion, very personal opinion, removal is a very important part of Magic the Gathering. There's a reason why Dice to Doomblade is such a meme. It's relevant to some archetypes in Gwent, RIP Gwent, like the on-damage Skellige archetype or the dreaded Spelatel. It's mostly present on niche tech cards in Marvel Snap, and it's very meta-dependent but generally decently powerful in Hearthstone, especially in some of the more removal-centric classes like Warrior, Warlock or Priest. Finally, it was initially extremely overpowered in Yu-Gi-Oh, but then power crept by a bunch of cards that are difficult to remove or target with removal. So, removal is not intrinsically powerful in every game. It's not like card draw, where it's a central mechanic that's difficult to balance because it's so powerful. It anecdotally happens to be powerful in some games, of course, but it's not nearly as powerful in others. But even when it's not game-breaking, even when it's perfectly balanced, it still does elicit a negative emotional response in many players. And when it hits just right, that response may be irritation, it may be that pang of sadness that I've previously described, but that emotion is undeniably negative. And I find that this negative emotional effect that removal cards have on players very often leads to them being perceived as more powerful than they actually are, which in turn leads to some rather tame cards being described as overpowered or game-breaking, like Killmonger in Marvel Snap. Killmonger kills 1-drops, the cheapest and least powerful units there are on both sides of the field. And it's a generally decent card. I use it in many decks, especially in decks that either can break the symmetry of its effect by not playing 1-drops of my own, or when playing against decks that heavily rely on flooding the board with cheap units, then Killmonger is a great card. But it's by no means problematic or overpowered, even though it was initially judged as such by a large part of the community. And I feel like this is an interesting one, because based on purely anecdotal evidence from the experiences of mine and my playgroups, I find that those reactive answer cards, your murders, your settle the wreckages, seem especially irritating for newcomers to the hobby. Like, this is not limited only to removal, the same thing is present in conversations regarding counterspells, for example, but nowhere is the divide more stark and visible than when removal is concerned. And this is something I'd very cautiously call a general trend. More casual, kitchen table with friends type of players will react more negatively to opponents, quote-unquote spoiling their fun, with those reactive mechanics that we talk about, while the more competitive players, your tournament grinders, players the MTG nomenclature would call spikes, will be more cautious of the dangers of uninteractivity and solitariness, which I'm not sure was a word until just now. This may come from a variety of factors, like the need for player agency growing as a player improves, or at least believes themselves to have improved. This may come from recognizing the necessary nature of reactive mechanics for fostering a healthy meta ecosystem, or it may simply come from being exposed to content creators. Because in nearly every TCG I followed, there has been a content creator touting uninteractivity to be a cardinal sin against the rules of good design. Now let's move on to the psychology that's both literally and figuratively at play here. Removal, in my opinion, feels decent to play, but it's probably not my favorite thing in the world. I would argue that it does help foster a healthy meta ecosystem though, because it balances those more uninteractive solitaire strategies. Those may be aggro or combo depending on games you play, but they are very often kept in check by removal throwing a wrench into their plans and removing their key pieces. And in that way, I would argue removal can be seen as sacrificing a small bit of fun during the match in the short term for a bit of fun for everyone in the longer term that only comes with playing games in a healthy, diverse meta ecosystem. I'm saying ecosystem a lot. Now, people will feel like getting your cards removed with a removal piece is not playing the game fully. Like with stacks, you're kind of going through the motions, but your expectations of effect are not met. As you play a big beater, you are expecting to be able to hit the opponent in the face with it, If you're playing Disenchantment, you are expecting to get a whole bunch of angels from it. And as the card gets removed, you find that your expectation is not fulfilled, and that's a bad feeling psychologically. And as you play more, you may begin to recognize that playing around removal, around board wipes, or even persevering through them can also be part of the fun. Eventually, you may even come to the realization that playing into removal, making them have it, as it's often referred to, may be the right decision, and making the right decision eases the pain of getting terminused in the face in response. After all, it feels a teensy bit more palatable to lose when you've made all the perfect choices and you're faultless and the game was obviously unwinnable. Another factor in removal cards being judged as unfun is that they are often designed to trade universality for high cost effectiveness. What I mean by that is that you won't get to use a removal piece as often as you would with a more proactive card. But when you do use it, it's going to have a bigger impact for its cost than a more universal proactive card would. It's the same conversation we have around tech cards, but maybe a bit less specialized. Let's take Murder, for example. It's a Magic the Gathering removal piece that costs 3 mana. It's not considered a great removal spell. It's not terrible, but it's also not premium. You can't kill your opponents with it, despite the name, and there's going to be situations where it's complete dead weight when it's in your hand. Like when you do have to kill your opponent fast, or when you're playing against a creatureless deck, and those are not that uncommon in some formats. But it can also kill a 7-drop for 3 mana. And when that narrow but very memorable show of force happens, it's going to be etched in your opponent's memory. Getting hit by that memorable occurrence is much easier to remember than the positive alternative, which is that nothing happened. Thus, if your Dreadmaw gets murdered, you're going to think of that as a waste of potential. It's going to be something that you remember. But when your Dreadmaw survives, you're not going to think, oh, I'm glad that it didn't get removed. At least, it's not going to be as salient psychologically. And there's also a psychological phenomenon at play called negativity bias, which makes it so that negative events have more of an effect on your emotional state, on your emotional well-being, than positive ones of similar proportion. So that helps season that memory with a bit of extra emotional spice. And like I've mentioned before, these two events, getting hit by removal and not getting hit by removal, are not judged as being of similar proportion psychologically, not in the slightest. It takes a bit of experience to find joy in nothing happening to you, which, as I've mentioned before, is the positive counterpart, is the positive equivalent of getting absolutely wrecked by a board wipe. But as you get more experience with the game, you are also more empathetic to what your opponent is doing as they are removing your cards. You're better able to put yourself in your opponent's shoes. Maybe you've played their deck at some point, or at least an archetype that's similar enough so that you can realize that their ability to answer your cards is finite and limited in some ways. And that helps with realizing that no, they are not this untouchable marble statue that's effortlessly rebuffing everything that you do. They are also paying some costs for their ability to do so. Those costs can be very well hidden, of course. They may be hidden in the deck building part of their preparation, they may be hidden in sideboarding, they may be hidden in the tempo losses that come with a pass and go type of playstyle, but those costs are generally going to be a bit more difficult to see when you're a beginner, when you're a newcomer to the game. So if you are working on your own card game, and I know that some of you are, big props, I would love to play them, you could make those hidden costs a bit easier to recognize for newcomers by stapling another small but visible cost on top of each removal card. Like, for example, paying 1 life in Magic the Gathering is a very small cost, but it causes the opponent to communicate that by casting that card, they are also paying something, they are sacrificing a resource. And that helps get the gears in a player's head turning, that maybe, hey, if they are paying a visible cost, they may be also paying some other invisible cost that I should think about before I call a card broken and decide to have a terrible time. And personally, I think that the psychological effect of adding another visible cost for the caster of the card, for the player of the card, is bigger psychologically than adding a benefit for the player on the receiving end. Because seriously, nobody is happy about getting Swords to Plowshare just because they got to gain some life. That very rarely happens. Of course, making a design decision like this will necessitate looking at other balance levers and adjoining subsystems in your game, because as it often happens, well, card games are games of many subsystems, and if you make a change in one, it's going to throw the other ones a bit out of whack. So, TLDR, I believe removal cards to be good for fostering a healthy meta. I'm not saying ecosystem this time, just a healthy meta. They do get less unfun with habituation, as the invisible costs that come along with playing them are more realized by the players, and I'm not going to say whether that newfound appreciation you get for them as you play more is like connoisseurship or more like a form of Stockholm Syndrome. You'll have to figure that one out yourself. And that's all I have for you today. I hope you've learned something about my perspective on removal cards, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I would be very appreciative of you clicking the subscribe button or the like button or the bell icon or leaving a nice comment, because those really help with both my motivation for making the videos as well as with the YouTube algorithm showing them to more people. So hey, if you end up doing that, big props. Thanks a lot for watching today, and I hope to see you in the next one.